Russia hardens its goals, and the West still doesn't understand why. Let me take you back to February 24, 2022, not the day Russia invaded Ukraine, but the day the world finally woke up to a war that had been simmering for 8 years. Most people remember the Russia launches unprovoked attack on Ukraine. The narrative was simple, almost comforting in its a revisionist power, drunk on imperial nostalgia, had lashed out against a democratic neighbor, and the free world had to stand firm. But here's what no one in the mainstream media told you at the time, and what too few are willing to admit: even that date wasn't the beginning of this conflict. It was the moment when a much older, much deeper geopolitical struggle finally burst into the open. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, first as a scholar, then as an advisor, and now as someone who watches these patterns repeat with an almost eerie predictability. And what I see today isn't just a war in Ukraine. It's the death rattle of an American-led unipolar order that has overreached for 30 years, and the birth of something far more dangerous: a multipolar world where the rules are being rewritten in blood and fire. When Colonel Douglas, what they want you to believe. The story goes like Russia, under the increasingly erratic leadership of Vladimir Putin, launched a brutal invasion of Ukraine to recreate the Soviet Union, intimidate NATO, and restore Russian greatness. The West, led by the United States, has responded with heroic resolve, arming Ukraine, imposing crippling sanctions, and rallying the free world to defend democracy. The war is a clear-cut moral David versus Goliath, good versus evil, the rules-based order versus brute force. And if we just stay the course, the narrative insists, Ukraine will eventually prevail, Russia will be humiliated, and the world will be safer for it. The data seems to support this. The U.S. has committed over $100 billion in military and economic aid to Ukraine. NATO has exited to within a stone's throw of St. Petersburg. Russian forces have suffered staggering casualties. Estimates range from 120,000 to 300,000 dead and wounded. The Russian economy, we're told, is on the brink of collapse under the weight of sanctions. And Putin? He's a cornered dictator, lashing out in desperation as his grip on power weakens. But there's a problem with this narrative. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Deconstructing the what's really happening in Ukraine. Let's start with the most uncomfortable: Russia is not losing this war. Not strategically, at least. And the idea that Putin is a madman acting on delusional whims is a dangerous oversimplification. First, the casualty numbers. Yes, Russia has taken heavy losses, but so has Ukraine. Western intelligence estimates suggest Ukrainian casualties are at least equal to Russia's, if not higher. The difference? Russia can afford them. Ukraine cannot. Russia has a population of 143 million, Ukraine, even before the war, had 41 million. Russia's economy, despite sanctions, is still larger than Italy's. And while the West has poured weapons into Ukraine, Russia has been quietly ramping up its defense production, outpacing the combined output of Europe and the US in key areas like artillery shells and drones. Then there's the battlefield. The much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023 failed spectacularly. Despite billions in Western arms, Ukrainian forces made negligible gains at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Meanwhile, Russia has methodically ground down Ukrainian defenses, capturing Avdiivka in February 2024, a city that had been a Ukrainian stronghold since 2014. The Russian military, once derided as a Potemkin force, has adapted. It's learned from its early mistakes, decentralized command, and is now fighting a war of attrition that plays to its mass, firepower, and indifference to casualties. But here's where it gets really interesting. Russia's goals have not just remained the same, they've hardened. And this is where Putin was overreaching, his ambitions were collapsing, and Russia would soon be forced to negotiate. But that's not what happened. Instead, Russia has doubled down. It's not just fighting for the Donbass anymore. It's fighting for Novorossiya, the historical term for southern and eastern Ukraine, stretching from Kharkiv to Odessa. It's not just defending Crimea, it's preparing for a long-term occupation of the territories it now controls. And most alarmingly, it's signaling that it will not stop until Ukraine is demilitarized, denazified, and neutralized, a demand that, in Russian eyes, is non-negotiable. This isn't just posturing. Look at the. Russia has annexed 4 Ukrainian regions and shows no sign of relinquishing them. These aren't temporary occupations, they're being integrated into the Russian Federation, with schools teaching Russian curriculum, banks operating under the ruble, and local officials taking loyalty oaths to Moscow. Russia is preparing for a long war. Defense spending has surged to 6% of GDP, higher than the US at the peak of the Cold War. The Russian military is now the third largest in the world by active personnel, and it's exting. Conscription has been increased, and a new 1.5 million strong army is being built by 2026. Russia is winning the economic war. Sanctions were supposed to cripple the Russian economy. Instead, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, faster than the Eurozone. Inflation is under control. The ruble has stabilized. And while the West has struggled to maintain unity, Russia has deepened ties with China, India, Iran, and the global South. The petrodollar is weakening, the yuan is rising. The economic balance of power is shifting, and Russia is at the center of it. So why is the West still clinging to the idea that Russia is on the ropes? Because admitting the truth that Russia is not just surviving but adapting, exting, and preparing for a decades-long struggle would force a reckoning that no one in Washington or Brussels is prepared to have. The broader geopolitical why this war was never just about Ukraine. Here's the part that keeps me up: this war was never just about Ukraine. It was about something much bigger, the future of global order. Let me tell you how we got here. After the Cold War, the US emerged as the world's sole superpower. For a brief moment, it seemed like history had ended. Democracy and free markets would spread, and the world would be safe under American leadership. But that moment didn't last. The US overreached. It extended NATO eastward, despite promises to the contrary. It bombed Serbia, invaded Iraq, toppled Libya, and tried to engineer regime change in Syria. It treated Russia not as a great power with legitimate security concerns but as a defeated nation that should accept its diminished status. Putin, for all his flaws, is not irrational. He's a realist in the purest sense of the word. He sees the world as it is, not as he wishes it to be. And what he sees is an America that refuses to accept the rise of a multipolar world. An America that still believes it can dictate the rules of the game, even as its relative power declines. Now, let's talk about spheres of influence, a concept that the US has spent the last century denying exists, even as it enforces its own. The Monroe Doctrine, after all, was nothing if not an assertion of America's exclusive dominance over the Western Hemisphere. But when Russia says it has vital interests in its near abroad, suddenly that's imperialism. When China asserts its claims in the South China Sea, it's aggression. But when the US stations troops in Poland, 100 miles from the Russian border, that's deterrence. This is the hypocrisy at the heart of American foreign policy. The US demands that other powers accept its global dominance while refusing to acknowledge that those same powers have their own core interests. And Ukraine? Ukraine is the fault line where these competing visions collide. Russia sees Ukraine as part of its civilizational sphere, a nation with deep historical, cultural, and economic ties to Moscow. The US sees Ukraine as a geopolitical pawn, a way to weaken Russia, ex NATO, and maintain American hegemony in Europe. Neither side is entirely wrong. But neither side is willing to back down. And here's the China is watching. Every day this war drags on, Beijing takes notes. It sees how the US reacts to a great power challenging its dominance. It sees the limits of Western unity. It sees the economic vulnerabilities of the dollar-based system. And when the time comes for Taiwan, China will have learned from Russia's mistakes and from America's. This isn't just a European war. It's a global power struggle, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Military: why the Hawks are wrong. Now, let's talk about the military situation. Because if there's one thing that should terrify anyone paying attention, it's the delusional optimism coming from Washington. The Hawks, people like Senator Lindsey Graham, former CIA Director David Petraeus, and a rotating cast of think tank warriors, keep insisting that if we just send more weapons, if we just give Ukraine F-16s, if we just let them strike deeper into Russia, then victory is within reach. This is the same kind of magical thinking that led us into Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. And it's just as dangerous. Let me be Ukraine cannot win this war militarily. Not in the way the West defines win. Even with unlimited Western support, Ukraine lacks the manpower, the industrial base, and the strategic depth to defeat Russia. The best-case scenario is a frozen conflict, a stalemate that drags on for years, with Ukraine as a permanently destabilized buffer state, its economy in ruins, its population decimated. But the hawks don't want to hear that. Because admitting that Ukraine can't win means admitting that the entire strategy is built on a lie. It means admitting that the US has no exit plan, no endgame, no vision beyond as long as it takes. And that's a recipe for disaster. Here's what's really happening on the Russia is outproducing the West in artillery. For every shell Ukraine fires, Russia fires 5 to 10. And while the US struggles to ramp up production, Russia has turned its economy into a war machine. By 2025, Russia will be producing 3 million artillery shells per year, more than the entire NATO alliance combined. Ukraine is running out of men. Zelensky has lowered the conscription age to 25, and reports suggest that desertions and draft dodging are skyrocketing. The Ukrainian military is bleeding out, and no amount of Western weapons can replace lost soldiers. The West is running out of weapons. The US has sent over 2,155mm shells to Ukraine. That's half of America's pre-war stockpile. The Pentagon has warned that if the war continues at this pace, the US will be out of shells by 2025. And Europe? Europe can't even meet its own defense needs, let alone Ukraine's. Russia is preparing for a long war. While the West debates whether to send ATACMS or long-range missiles, Russia is digging in. It's building fortified defensive lines that stretch for hundreds of miles. It's training new brigades. It's preparing for a generational conflict. This isn't a war that can be won in the traditional sense. It's a war of attrition, and Russia is better positioned to survive it. The domestic political why no one in Washington wants to lose. So why does the US keep doubling down? Why does the Biden administration keep sending billions in aid, even as the war grinds on with no end in sight? The answer, as always, is domestic politics. Let's start with Joe Biden. This war has become the centerpiece of his foreign policy legacy. After Afghanistan, Biden needed to win a way to prove that America was still the leader of the free world. Ukraine was that win. And now, with an election looming, Biden can't afford to admit that the war is unwinnable. Because if he does, he looks weak. And in American politics, weakness is death. Then there's the military-industrial complex. This war has been a goldmine for defense contractors. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're all making record profits. And they have lobbyists in every corner of Washington, making sure the money keeps flowing. The longer the war lasts, the more they make. And they have no incentive to push for peace. And let's not forget the neoconservatives. These are the same people who brought us Iraq, Libya, and Syria. They see this war as a chance to weaken Russia permanently, to break it up, to turn it into a vassal state. They don't care about Ukraine. They care about American dominance. And they'll keep pushing for escalation, no matter the cost. But here's the dirty little: most Americans don't care about Ukraine. Polls show that support for the war is softening. A majority of Americans now say the US is doing too much to help Ukraine. And in an election year, that's a problem for Biden. So what does the administration do? It ramps up the rhetoric. It talks about democracy versus autocracy. It warns that if we don't stand up to Putin, he'll invade Poland, and it fears mongers to keep the money flowing. But here's the: Putin has no interest in invading Poland. Or the Baltics. Or anywhere else in NATO. Because Putin is a realist. He knows that attacking a NATO member would trigger Article 5, and that would mean war with the US. And no matter how much the hawks in Washington want to believe otherwise, Russia is not suicidal. The real danger isn't that Putin will invade Poland. The real danger is that we'll stumble into a war with Russia by accident, because of a miscalculation, a provocation, or a desperate Ukrainian gamble that goes wrong. Scenario where this war is headed. So where does this end? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. The war grinds on for years, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Ukraine becomes a permanently divided state, like Korea or Cyprus. The West keeps pumping in money and weapons, but the front lines barely move. Russia consolidates control over the territories it has seized, integrating them into its economy and political system. Ukraine becomes a failed state on Europe's doorstep, a black hole of corruption and instability. And the US? It gets stuck in another endless war, draining resources and attention from more pressing threats like China. Scenario 2, the Ukrainian collapse. This is the nightmare scenario for the West. Ukraine's manpower and resources run out. Russia launches a major offensive, breaking through Ukrainian lines and capturing more territory. Zelensky is overthrown in a coup, or flees the country. A pro-Russian government takes power in Kiev, and Ukraine becomes a Russian client state. The West's credibility is shattered. NATO fractures. And the world sees that American power has limits. Scenario 3, the Great Power War. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. The war escalates beyond Ukraine. Maybe a Ukrainian strike on Russian soil kills high-ranking officials. Maybe a NATO supply convoy is hit by a Russian missile. Maybe the US decides to enforce a no-fly zone, and a Russian jet is shot down. Whatever the spark, the result is the direct conflict between NATO and Russia. And once that happens, all bets are off. Because in a war between nuclear powers, there are no winners. The grand strategy why America keeps losing. Here's the hard: the US has no grand strategy. It has a series of tactical reactions, driven by domestic politics, short-term thinking, and an unwillingness to accept that the world is changing. For 30 years, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights across the globe. And for 30 years, that policy has failed. In Iraq, we spent $2 trillion and lost 4,500 soldiers to create a failed state that's now a proxy for Iran. In Afghanistan, we spent 20 years and $2 trillion to hand the country back to the Taliban. In Libya, we toppled Gaddafi, creating a humanitarian catastrophe and a haven for terrorists. In Syria, we armed moderate rebels who turned out to be al-Qaeda affiliates. And now, in Ukraine, we're repeating the same mistakes. We're pouring billions into a war we can't win, with no clear endgame, while our real strategic competitor, China, grows stronger by the day. This isn't just bad policy. It's strategic malpractice. The US needs a realist foreign policy, one that accepts the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Recognizing that great. Here's the uncomfortable truth: realism isn't isolationism. It's not about retreating from the world. It's about choosing our battles wisely, understanding our core interests, and recognizing that not every conflict is ours to fix. And right now, the US is failing at all three. Let me explain why this matters. The Biden administration's approach to Ukraine isn't just flawed, it's actively accelerating the very multipolar world it claims to want to prevent. Every dollar we send to Kiev is a dollar that isn't being spent on deterring China in the Pacific. Every NATO action eastward is another provocation that pushes Russia closer to Beijing. And every time we dismiss Moscow's red lines as bluffs, we increase the odds of a miscalculation that could spiral into catastrophe. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. The US has spent the last 3 decades acting as the world's sole superpower, but that era is ending. China's GDP is on track to surpass America's by 2030. Russia, despite its economic weaknesses, remains a nuclear-armed state with the ability to project power globally. And the global South, India, Brazil, South Africa, even Saudi Arabia, is increasingly refusing to pick sides, hedging its bets between Washington and Beijing. Here's the data that should keep policymakers awake at night. In 2000, the US accounted for 31% of global GDP. Today, it's 25%. China's share has grown from 4% to 18% in the same period. And while America's defense budget is still larger than the next 10 countries combined, that advantage is shrinking. China now has more naval ships than the US. Russia's hypersonic missiles can strike targets in Europe in minutes, and its nuclear arsenal is being modernized at a pace that outstrips America's own upgrades. But the real problem isn't just the numbers, it's the mindset. The US foreign policy establishment still operates under the assumption that we can dictate terms to the world. That if we just spend enough, arm enough proxies, and lecture enough about democracy, the rest of the planet will fall in line. It's the same hubris that led us into Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. And it's the same hubris that's leading us into a potential disaster in Ukraine. Let's talk about the military implications. The Pentagon's own war games suggest that in a direct conflict with Russia, NATO would struggle to hold the line in the Baltics. A 2020 RAND Corporation study found that Russian forces could reach Tallinn or Riga in 60 hours, far faster than NATO could reinforce them. And that's before we even consider the nuclear dimension. Russia's doctrine allows for the use of tactical nukes in a conventional conflict if it faces an existential threat. That's not a bluff, it's a stated policy. Now, you might be thinking, but Russia is weak. Its economy is the size of Italy's. Its military is bogged down in Ukraine. And you'd be right on paper. But war isn't fought on paper. Russia has shown a willingness to absorb staggering losses in pursuit of its goals. Over 300,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded in Ukraine, and yet Putin's grip on power remains unshaken. The Russian economy has weathered sanctions better than expected, thanks in part to China's willingness to buy its oil and sell it dual-use technology. And most importantly, Russia has demonstrated that it can outlast the West in a war of attrition. Here's the longer this war drags on, the more likely it becomes that Russia will achieve at least some of its objectives. Not because it's winning on the battlefield, though it has made incremental gains, but because the West's resolve is fracturing. The US Congress is deadlocked over further aid to Ukraine. European nations are running low on artillery shells. And public support for the war is eroding. A recent Pew Research poll found that only 31% of Americans believe the US is doing too little to help Ukraine, a sharp decline from 2022. So where does that leave us? If the US wants to avoid a humiliating defeat in Ukraine, and more importantly, if it wants to deter China from making a move on Taiwan, it needs to rethink its entire approach. That means accepting that Ukraine will not be a NATO member anytime soon. It means pushing Kyiv to negotiate, even if that means territorial concessions. And it means shifting our focus to the Indo-Pacific, where the real long-term threat to American primacy lies. But here's the foreign policy blob in Washington doesn't do realism. It doesn't do compromise. It does moralizing, escalation, and wishful thinking. And until that changes, we're going to keep stumbling from one crisis to the next, wondering why the world isn't bending to our will. Let me leave you with this. In 1947, George Kennan wrote the Long Telegram, outlining the strategy of containment that would define the Cold War. Kennan's genius wasn't just in recognizing the threat posed by the Soviet Union, it was in understanding that America couldn't defeat communism everywhere, all at once. We had to pick our battles, husband our resources, and play the long game. Today, we need a new Kennan. Someone who can look at the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, and craft a strategy that preserves American power without bankrupting the country or risking nuclear war. But I'm not holding my breath. Because in Washington, realism is still a dirty word. And until that changes, we're going to keep losing. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy failure, it's a domestic political crisis in the making. The longer this war drags on, the more it exposes the fractures in America's own political system, fractures that Moscow is actively exploiting. And if you think the Kremlin isn't paying attention to the chaos in Washington, you're kidding yourself. Every time Congress deadlocks over Ukraine funding, every time a Republican presidential candidate calls for cutting aid, every time a progressive Democrat questions the blank check approach, the Russians see it as confirmation of their strategy. They don't need to win on the battlefield if they can win in the halls of Congress. Let me explain why this matters. The 2024 U.S. election is shaping up to be a referendum on Ukraine, whether we like it or not. Donald Trump has already made it clear that if he wins, he'll push for a rapid end to the war on terms that would almost certainly favor Russia. His allies in Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, have been vocal about their opposition to further aid. On the other side, the Biden administration is trapped. They can't afford to look weak, but they also can't ignore the growing fatigue among voters. A recent Gallup poll found that 41% of Americans now believe the U.S. is doing too much to help Ukraine, up from just 7% in 2022. That's a seismic shift in public opinion, and it's happening in real time. Here's the uncomfortable: the American political class is sleepwalking into a disaster. They're treating Ukraine as if it's still 2022, when the world was united in outrage over Russia's invasion. But the world has moved on. The global south has largely shrugged off Western sanctions. China is quietly supplying Russia with dual-use technology. And even in Europe, cracks are forming. Hungary's Viktor Orbán has already vetoed EU aid packages, and Slovakia's new government is openly questioning whether Ukraine can ever win. The idea that the West can maintain a united front indefinitely is delusional. So what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. If the US continues to dither on aid, Ukraine's position will deteriorate further. The Russians are already making slow but steady gains in the Donbass, and if they capture Chasiv, a key strategic hub, they'll have a clear path to the rest of the region. That could trigger a collapse in Ukrainian morale, leading to a negotiated settlement on terms that would effectively hand Russia control over much of the east and south. Kyiv would be left as a rump state, dependent on Western aid but with no real path to NATO membership. It's not the outcome anyone wanted, but it's the most likely one if the current trajectory holds. But there's another possibility, one that Washington isn't prepared to confront. What if Russia doesn't just settle for the Donbass? What if Putin decides to go all in, launching a major offensive to capture Odessa or even Kyiv? The Russian military has shown it can adapt, and if they believe the West is truly fracturing, they might gamble on a knockout blow. That would force the US and Europe into an impossible escalate to the point of direct conflict with Russia, or accept a humiliating defeat. Neither option is palatable, which is why the Biden administration is desperately trying to thread the needle, providing just enough aid to keep Ukraine in the fight, but not enough to actually win. Now, let's talk about the domestic fallout. If Ukraine loses, the political recriminations in Washington will be brutal. The neoconservatives and liberal interventionists who pushed for this war will blame the isolationists for abandoning Kyiv. The isolationists will blame the establishment for dragging the US into another endless conflict. And the American people, who have grown increasingly skeptical of foreign entanglements, will demand answers. The 2024 election could become a referendum on America's role in the world, with Trump and his allies arguing that the US needs to retreat from global commitments and focus on domestic issues. But here's the: even if Trump wins and pulls the plug on Ukraine, it won't solve the underlying problem. Because the real issue isn't just about Ukraine, it's about America's ability to lead in a multipolar world. The post-Cold War era, when the US could dictate terms to the rest of the planet, is over. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. And the global south is increasingly assertive. If the US wants to maintain its influence, it needs to adapt. That means accepting that we can't be the world's policeman. It means prioritizing our core interests, like deterring China in the Indo-Pacific, over peripheral conflicts. And it means recognizing that diplomacy, not just military power, is the key to managing great power competition. Let me give you an example. In 1972, Richard Nixon went to China, shocking the world and reshaping the Cold War. He didn't do it because he loved Mao Zedong. He did it because he understood that America's long-term interests required a balance of power in Asia. Today, we need a similar moment of strategic clarity. We need to recognize that Russia is not going away, that China is the bigger threat, and that we can't afford to be bogged down in a war of attrition in Ukraine. That doesn't mean abandoning Kyiv. It means pushing for a negotiated settlement that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty while acknowledging the reality on the ground. But here's the foreign policy establishment in Washington doesn't do strategic clarity. They do moral posturing. They do escalation. They do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And until that changes, we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes. The war in Ukraine is just the latest symptom of a deeper problem, a refusal to accept that the world has changed, and that America's role in it must change too. So where does that leave us? In the short term, I expect more of the half measures, muddling through, and a slow erosion of Western support for Ukraine. In the long term, I expect a reckoning. Either the US will finally embrace a more realistic foreign policy, or it will keep stumbling from crisis to crisis, wondering why the rest of the world no longer listens. And if that happens, we won't just lose in Ukraine. We'll lose the 21st century.